The year was 1943, and somewhere in the heart of occupied France, a young woman crouched in the shadows of an abandoned farmhouse, her fingers moving across the keys of a clandestine radio transmitter with a speed and precision that would have impressed even the most seasoned military operators. And outside the crumbling stone walls, German patrol vehicles prowled the darkened countryside, their direction finding equipment, scanning the airwaves for exactly the kind of signal she was sending, and she knew they were coming. She could feel it in her bones, yet she kept transmitting because the lives of hundreds of resistance fighters depended on the message reaching London. And this is the story of Noor Inayat Khan, the woman radio operator who refused to surrender. She was born in Moscow on New Year's Day 1914, to an Indian father and an American mother, a child of two worlds, destined to become a citizen of many more. And her father, Hazrat Inayat Khan, was a renowned Sufi mystic and musician who had brought the message of universal love and spiritual harmony to the West. And young Noora grew up surrounded by music, poetry, and the teachings of nonviolence, absorbing her father's belief that the soul's highest purpose was service to humanity. But what happened next changed everything, because the world her father dreamed of was about to be consumed by the flames of the most destructive war in human history. The family settled in Paris when Noora was still a child, and she came to love France as deeply as she loved the India of her father's stories and the America of her mother's heritage. And she studied music at the Paris Conservatory, composed children stories that spoke of gentleness and wonder, and seemed destined for a life of quiet creativity and spiritual contemplation. And then, in May of 1940, the German Wehrmacht came roaring across the border, and everything she knew was shattered in a matter of weeks as the French army collapsed and the Nazi flag rose over the city. She called home. Noor and her family fled to England just ahead of the German occupation, joining the desperate exodus of refugees who crowded onto boats crossing the channel toward the uncertain safety of British shores. And she arrived in a nation preparing for invasion, a nation that would soon stand alone against the full might of Nazi Germany. And something stirred within her, something that surprised even herself, because despite her upbringing in the philosophy of nonviolence, she felt an overwhelming need to fight back against the darkness that was spreading across Europe. And yet she never imagined this moment would reshape her destiny. She joined the Women's Auxiliary Air Force and trained as a radio operator, discovering that she possessed an extraordinary talent for wireless telegraphy, and her fingers flew across the Morse code keys with an almost supernatural fluidity, sending and receiving messages faster than operators who had been doing it for years. And the Special Operations Executive Notice, as it was known, had been created by Winston Churchill himself, with a mandate to set Europe ablaze through sabotage, espionage, and the support of resistance movements. And they were desperately seeking agents who could operate behind enemy lines, and Noor Inayat Khan seemed almost too perfect to be true. But she was not a typical candidate for the dangerous world of covert operations, because her instructors worried about her gentleness, her sensitivity, her deep moral convictions, and some of them questioned whether a woman raised on principles of nonviolence and universal love could survive. The brutal realities of occupied France were one wrong word, one moment of hesitation could mean torture and death. And yet there was something in her eyes, a quiet steel beneath the softness, that convinced her superiors to take a chance. And so began her transformation from musician and dreamer into one of the most unlikely secret agents of the Second World War. The training was brutal and exhaustive, covering everything from silent killing techniques to the operation of various radio equipment, to the art of living a double life under constant surveillance. And Noor absorbed it all with fierce determination, memorizing codes and cover stories, learning to spot surveillance and shake a tail, practicing the lies she would have to tell every day if she wanted to stay alive. And her instructors noted that, while she struggled with some aspects of her radio skills were nothing short of extraordinary. And when she transmitted, her touch was so distinctive, so recognizable, that London could identify her signal anywhere. And then something no one expected happened, because in June of 1943, Noor Inayat Khan was flown into occupied France by Lysander aircraft, landing in a moonlit field somewhere south of Paris, and becoming the first female radio operator to be inserted into enemy territory by the Special Operations Executive. And she carried with her a small suitcase containing her wireless transmitter, her codes, and her cover identity as a children's nurse named Jean-Marie Renair. And she carried something else as well, a burden of knowledge that the average life expectancy for a radio operator in occupied France was 6 weeks. The Prosper network she had been sent to support was already in crisis when she arrived, and within weeks of her landing, the Gestapo struck with devastating precision, arresting the network's leader and rolling up cell after cell in a catastrophic wave of betrayals and captures. And suddenly Noor found herself virtually alone, the last remaining wireless link between the shattered remnants of the French resistance in Paris and the SO headquarters in London. And her superiors offered to extract her, understanding that her position had become almost impossibly dangerous. But what she discovered next would shake even her commanders. Because Noor refused to leave, and she sent a message back to London that would become legendary in the annals of the SO, saying that she was the only transmitter left, and that she would stay as long as she could still be of use. And so began the most remarkable chapter of her remarkable life, as she moved from safe house to safe house, always one step ahead of the Gestapo, transmitting vital intelligence back to London, while the enemy closed in around her like a tightening noose. And every time she set up her equipment and began to transmit, she knew the German direction-finding vehicles were hunting for her signal. Picture, if you will, the scene inside a cramped Parisian attic as Noor crouched over her wireless set, the summer heat making the small space almost unbearable and sweat dripping from her forehead. As her fingers danced across the keys and she could hear the rumble of German vehicles in the street below, could sense the invisible net of radio detection equipment sweeping through the neighborhood, searching, always searching, and she had to transmit for at least 20 minutes to get her message through, but every minute increased the chance that the Germans would triangulate her position, and she kept going anyway because the information she was sending could save lives. Behind these ruins a secret waited, because Noor had become more than just a radio operator, and she had taken on the work of rebuilding the shattered Prosper network, recruiting new agents, establishing new safe houses, creating new channels of communication, and she did all of this while being the most hunted woman in Paris. While her face appeared on Gestapo wanted posters, while collaborators and informers lurked around every corner, and she survived through a combination of courage, cunning, and what could only be described as an almost supernatural ability to sense danger before it materialized. For 4 months, she evaded capture, moving through the occupied city like a ghost, transmitting messages that helped coordinate resistance operations across northern France. And the Germans knew. She was out there, knew that someone was sending a stream of coded messages to London, but they could not catch her no matter how many resources they devoted to the hunt, and her superiors in London watched in amazement, as this gentle woman who had worried them during training proved to be one of the most resourceful and courageous agents they had ever deployed. And they would later say that her work during those 4 months was worth the sacrifice of many lives. But the net was closing in, and betrayal was coming from a direction no one expected. Because in October of 1943, a French woman named Renée Gary, who had been trusted by the resistance, sold Noor to the Gestapo for 100,000 francs, and the Germans came for her at an apartment in Paris where she had been hiding, and even then, even in that moment of capture, Noor refused to surrender without a fight, and she struggled so fiercely that it took multiple Gestapo agents to subdue her, and one of them would later testify that he had never seen such resistance from any prisoner, male or female. What followed was a nightmare that would test the limits of human endurance, because the Gestapo knew exactly how valuable she was, and they wanted her codes, her contacts, her knowledge of SO operations, and they interrogated her for weeks, using every technique at their disposal to break her will, and Noor gave them nothing, and she lied. She misdirected, she pretended to cooperate while feeding them false information, and she tried to escape, not once, but twice, displaying a courage and determination that left even her captors astonished and terrified. The first escape attempt came when she managed to climb out of a bathroom window at the Gestapo headquarters, and she made it onto the rooftops of Paris before being recaptured. And the second attempt was even more daring. A coordinated effort with 2 other SO agents that came heartbreakingly close to success before an air raid alert sent guards rushing to check on the prisoners. And when the Germans realized the depth of her resistance, the lengths to which she would go to resist them, they classified her as highly dangerous and shipped her to Germany for further punishment. She was taken to Pforzheim prison in Germany, where she was held in chains for 10 months, and the conditions were almost beyond comprehension, as she was kept in complete isolation, shackled hand and foot, fed starvation rations, beaten regularly, and denied any contact with other human beings. And still she refused to cooperate, and still she gave the Germans nothing of value, and still she held on to her spirit, her dignity, her unbreakable will, and the guards who watched over her would later speak with something like awe about the prisoner who never stopped resisting, never stopped hoping, never stopped believing. And then in September of 1944, as Allied forces were liberating France, and the war was clearly turning against the Nazi regime, Noor Inayat Khan was transported to Dachau concentration camp, along with 3 other female SO agents. and on the morning of September 13th, 1944, she was taken to the execution ground and forced to kneel in the dirt. And in her final moment, before the SS officer raised his pistol, this woman who had endured so much, who had refused to break, who had embodied the very essence of resistance, spoke a single word, and that word was liberte. She was 30 years old, and she had given everything for a country that was not even hers by birth, and for principles of freedom and human dignity that transcended all boundaries of nation and race, and the world would not learn the full story of her sacrifice until after the war, when surviving witnesses and captured German records revealed the extraordinary extent of her courage, and when Britain finally understood what Noor Inayat Khan had done, they awarded her the George Cross, the highest civilian honor for bravery, making her the first Indian woman to receive this decoration. But the story does not end with medals and memorials, because Noor's legacy lives on in ways that go far beyond the recognition she received, and her life stands as proof that the most unexpected people can become the greatest heroes. And that true courage is not the absence of fear, but the determination to act in spite of it, and that the principles of love and service that her father taught her were not contradicted by her fight against tyranny, but were in fact the very foundation of it. The children's stories. She wrote before, the war spoke of gentleness and wonder of animals and princes, and the magic that exists in everyday kindness. And there is something almost unbearably poignant about the fact that the same woman who created such tender tales would die in a Nazi concentration camp, having fought against evil with every fiber of her being. And yet there is no contradiction here, because Noor understood what many fail to grasp, that love and courage are not opposites, but partners that gentleness and strength can coexist in the same heart, and that sometimes the most loving thing one can do is to stand against darkness regardless of the cost. Her name is remembered today in ways that would have astonished her in her lifetime, because there is a statue of her in London's Gordon Square near the house where she once lived. And there is a memorial plaque at the house in Paris where she was captured, and her face has appeared on British postage stamps and school children. Learn her story, and researchers continue to uncover new details about her extraordinary life, and the woman who operated in the shadows has finally stepped into the light of history. And when we think of the Second World War, we think of the great battles, the massive armies, the famous generals who commanded millions of men, and yet the war was also won by people like Noor Inayat Khan, by individuals who chose to resist, who chose to fight, who chose to sacrifice everything for something greater than themselves. And their stories remind us that history is not only made by those who command armies, but by those who refuse to surrender their principles, even when surrender would be so much easier. She moved through occupied Paris like a ghost. Her radio transmitted her only weapon, her courage, her only armor, and she sent messages into the night that helped save lives and shorten the war. And she did it knowing that each transmission might be her last. And when they finally caught her, she fought back. And when they tortured her, she told them nothing. And when they killed her, she died with the word freedom on her lips. And if that is not heroism, then the word has no meaning. The farmhouses where she hid are still standing in the French countryside, and the Paris streets she walked are still there, though the city has changed beyond recognition, and somewhere in the ether, the radio waves she sent still echo in some quantum sense, rippling outward forever, carrying messages of hope and resistance and courage. In the woman who sent them is gone, but her spirit remains an inspiration to all who hear her story, and a reminder of what one person can accomplish when they refuse to give up. Noor Inayat Khan, the princess who became a spy, the pacifist who became a warrior, the gentle soul who became a symbol of unbreakable resistance. And her story is not just history. It is a challenge to each of us to ask ourselves what we would do in her place. Whether we would have the courage to keep transmitting while the enemy closed in, whether we would have the strength to endure what she endured, whether we would have the faith to whisper freedom with our dying breath. And so we remember her today not just as a hero of the Second World War, but as a testament to the power of the human spirit to rise above circumstances that seem impossible, and to the truth that courage comes in many forms, and often from the most unexpected sources, and that sometimes the quiet ones, the gentle ones, the dreamers and the poets are the ones who burn the brightest. When the darkness comes, and Noor Inayat Khan burned so brightly that her light still guides us more than 80 years after she gave her life for liberty. This was not just a story about war, but a story about what it means to be human, and about the choices that define us, and about the extraordinary capacity for courage that exists within ordinary people. And Noor's legacy is not just that she refused to surrender, but that she showed us what refusing to surrender looks like, and what it costs, and why it matters. And her memory will endure as long as there are people who believe that freedom is worth fighting for, and that some things more important than survival. The last message she ever sent from occupied France before her capture contained intelligence that helped the Allies prepare for the liberation of Europe, and she could not have known then that her work would contribute to the defeat of the Nazi regime that she would never live to see, and she could not have known that she would be remembered and honored across the decades, that her name would become synonymous with courage under impossible pressure, and she did not do what she did for recognition or glory, but simply because it was right and because she could not do otherwise, and that perhaps is the truest definition of heroism.